Welcome back to Accessible Gourmet. Today we're getting fancy with poached lobster with a cauliflower puree. To start this dish, I have 3 4-ounce lobster tails, and I'm just taking a pair of kitchen shears, getting underneath that shell and chopping this right down the middle. You could definitely just chop these pieces in half and then with a knife, but I'd like to keep these whole because they are pretty small already. So I'm just pulling the shell away from the meat of the lobster, doing it gently because I don't want anything to rip. So we're just pulling that shell away from the meat and then holding on to the very bottom of the tail and giving this little tug, and that should come out pretty nicely. So we're going to reserve the shells for our poaching broth, and we're going to put the meat in the fridge until we're ready to use it. Now moving on to our cauliflower puree mise en place, we need 1 medium onion. I've just split this in half and I'm giving this a nice little choppity chop, putting it in a bowl and setting it aside. We also need 4 cloves of garlic, which we're going to finely mince, putting it in a small bowl, and say it with me, setting it aside. I have a 2-pound head of cauliflower here. I'm just chopping off that stem end. And then we're going to cut this right down the middle. And we're going to lay this on the flat side to be safe so nothing rolls around. Go in at an angle and just remove the core of that cauliflower. This is going to help release all of those little florets, which we're going to break up and put in a bowl. Oh, also I got this great new Hedley & Bennett apron. You can see it in this video. I love it. It's part of the mystery sale. Anyway, moving on to our lobster mise en place. I have a 2-inch piece of leek here. I'm just chopping off that hairy root end, taking off that hard outer layer, and I should have put that in my veggie scrap bag, but I forgot and I threw it away. You could also compost that. Now we're chopping our leek in half and then into quarters, and then giving this a nice little chop up into a fine julienne. Because leeks are notoriously dirty because of the way they grow, they push up through the soil and all that dirt gets trapped into those nice little tight circles. We are going to give this a really thorough rinse in a strainer just to make sure all that sand and grit is out. We're also going to wipe down our bench to make sure there's no sand on that as well. But put those in a little strainer, give them a really good rinse because no one wants to bite down on grit in their meal. We also need 2 wedges of preserved lemon. I made these a couple of weeks ago. You can hop onto my Instagram to see how I did that, but just remove that pulp because we're not going to use that. You never really do with preserved lemons. You just use the peel. So we're giving this a nice little julienne before we give this a fine dice. We're also going to need 3 cloves of garlic. I'm just smashing and peeling this. We're not going to dice this up. We're going to leave these relatively whole, but you want to smash them just to release a little of that allicin so you get that flavor throughout our poaching broth. Next up is my beautiful beefsteak tomato. I was looking for heirloom. I couldn't find one, but this works just as well. So we want to take the skin off of this, and to do that I cut a little X in the bottom of the tomato, put it into some boiling water for 20 seconds, plunged it into an ice bath, and then that should peel right off. We also need to de-seed these tomatoes because we don't want seeds in our poaching liquid, and removing any of that core, that hard core in the middle, and giving these a nice little choppity chop as well into a fine dice. We want the dice a little small because we want this to kind of break down into our broth. Putting this in a bowl and moving on to the rest of our ingredients. I have a tablespoon of oregano here. You can use marjoram. I couldn't find marjoram, so I'm just substituting it with what I have. We also need a tablespoon and a half of parsley. Just pull off those leaves, roll this up, choppity chop it, put it in a bowl, and we should be ready to move over to our stovetop now to start this meal. We're going to start with our puree first since it takes a little longer. So in a heavy bottom saucepan, I'm melting 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter, adding in my onions, giving this a little stirring, letting this saute for about 5 minutes, just so those onions sweat a little bit. After 5 minutes, I'm going to add in my garlic, stir this around just until the garlic is fragrant, add in a sprig of fresh thyme. a friggin' sprig, and then all of our cauliflower florets. We're gonna give this a stir. Let this cook for 5 minutes before we add in a cup of heavy cream and a cup of vegetable stock. I added both to one measuring cup just for one less vessel to have to clean. Now we are going to cook this and simmer it over medium-low heat for 20 minutes or until that liquid reduces by 3/4. Give this a little salt and pepper. We're going to taste this at the end and season more if we need it. So for now, season lightly. We're going to move this over to a different burner while we start on our poaching liquid. So to a large saute pan, I'm adding 1 cup of a dry white wine and adding in our scrubbed, cleaned lobster shells. We want to extract as much flavor as we can. We don't want anything to go to waste when it comes to lobster, especially lobster because it's so expensive. So we're going to let this simmer for 10 minutes before we add in our preserved lemon, our 3 cloves of garlic, as well as a fresh bay leaf. You can use a dry bay leaf as well. And stir that around, let that cook for 2 minutes. At this point, our lobster shells have given all they can. They have made a great effort and we appreciate them, but they've done their job and we can now discard them. At this point, we're going to add in our freshly washed leeks, as well as all of our tomatoes, and we're going to let this cook for about 15 minutes. We want those tomatoes to really start to break down. Now that our tomatoes have broken down a bit, we are going to start adding in 8 tablespoons of butter. This is unsalted cultured butter. We're adding a tablespoon at a time and we're stirring it around till it melts before we add the next tablespoon. We want this to emulsify into a beautiful poaching liquid. We don't want this to boil because then this will break and we'll have to start over. So go slowly, let the butter melt, continuously stir this around before we add in our next pat of butter. Once our last pat of butter is in, you can see that's starting to look super silky and really lovely. We can add in our fresh herbs as well as a pinch of saffron. You can skip the saffron, I just like it for the color. Now we're going to give this a taste, season if it needs some salt and pepper. Then we're going to gently place in our lobster tails and we're going to let this sit in here and poach for 10 minutes. We don't want to overcook our lobster tails because it'll get rubbery and that's never a good thing. While that poaches, we're going to move back to our puree, remove our thyme stem, use an immersion blender or a regular blender if you have one. If you don't have an immersion blender, you can use a regular blender. Just make sure it cools down a little before you puree it. Now our lobster tails are almost done, so we can start plating. So I'm laying down a big, healthy spoonful of that lovely cauliflower puree. Topping that with our lovely lobster tails. And then we're going to spoon over our butter sauce. You will have sauce left over, so I am going to recommend that you store that in a container, put it in the freezer. If you're ever making a lobster bisque or seafood chowder, add that to it. It's going to add a ton of flavor. If you're feeling fancy, you can also decorate your plate. It's not often that we eat this way, so let's have a little taste. The cauliflower puree is silky, smooth, just really perfect for our lobster. It's a great little partnership there. The lobster is cooked perfectly as well. It's not overcooked, it's still tender. You get an acidic bite from the tomatoes, a little onion flavor from the leek, as well as that smooth richness from the butter. But there it is, poached lobster with cauliflower puree. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, give it a like. If you loved it, subscribe and click the notification bell because I put out new videos every Thursday. Until next time, happy cooking.